We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. High-stakes talks this week between officials from the U.S. and China over trade. Donald Trump says a deal is near with China, but the Chinese government has been dubious about the actual negotiating position of the Trump White House. Professor Wolff, welcome back.
Thank you, Brian. Glad to be here.
Richard, it really looked for a moment as if the tariffs were going to basically sink trade. In other words, end trade between China and the United States, at least for the time being. You know, we talked about the ports and the West Coast ports in particular. All the cargo ships were basically empty. There was no trade going on. And then Trump basically, in essence, backed down. You know, some of Trump's critics now, even those in the Republican Party, have coined a new phrase. It's called taco. Trump always chickens out. Well, let's see about that. But anyway, Trump is touting the fact that a deal is near, that the Chinese have agreed to sell to the United States rare earth minerals that are, considered to be central for many high-tech industries. And at the same time, in the recent month, about 3 weeks ago, the Commerce Department imposed a warning. They issued a warning suggesting that anyone who sells advanced chips to Huawei, the Chinese technology company, or use their chips would become sanctioned. And as a consequence, all of the trade talks between China and the United States basically ceased. Now the Chinese are demanding clarification. The Trump administration is saying, oh, no, we were just restating a given policy. We weren't reneging on our earlier deal. Anyway, I want to get your thoughts. Obviously, these are the two biggest trading partners in the world, the two biggest economies in the world. The impact is going to have a big, outsized impact on everyone. Where are we at right now, Richard?
Well, in this discussion, in this topic, we have an extra problem. That is that the media, mostly here in the United States, which are the ones that you and I and most of the folks listening and watching, I suspect, are dependent on more or less, and the European media aren't that different. There's a gap. Let's call it a truth gap or a reality gap, whatever you like, that's much bigger than usual. I mean, what is being told here, let me stress so that everyone understands. Negotiations over trade are always done simultaneously by all of the corporations that are concerned with it, among themselves, and between them and the governments over whom they have whatever power they may have. That's one set of discussions. Then there are discussions among the political leaders of the countries that are discussing this subject. And then there are the professional media managers whose job it is to frame and control what is leaked to the media or what is told to the media, and it's always both. In other words, you and I are looking at bits and fragments and trying to make sense of it. That's what we're dealing with. Therefore, any given day's comments, especially by an on-again, off-again president like Trump, has to be taken not just with a grain of salt, but with a mountain of salt, because it doesn't necessarily mean anything. All right, why is this important? There are companies right now and I'll give you some examples in a moment, who are very eager to have these discussions end in one way. They want no tariffs because these are companies that do one or the other of both of the following things. One, they export to China, and they don't want the Chinese retaliating, which they clearly will do because they've done it every time, to the United States' tariffs. Mr. Trump liked to say, both in his first presidency and now, that trade wars are easy to win and tariff wars likewise. He assumed, because his advisors said so, that the rest of the world would be intimidated and dare not tariff. Okay, this is wrong. The rest of the world, led by China, retaliated, immediately went and did it again. So there are American companies directly hurt by the Chinese tariffs imposed in retaliation to the American. Everybody knows that. The Chinese have been very careful to delay their retaliation, so they are never the first ones. They're always the second ones. And as if to drive the point home even more, they have never raised it as much as the United States. Even at the high point, the United States raised our tariff against China to 145%. The Chinese only raised it to 120 or 125. Very careful theater to show we're not doing this, we are retaliating. So these companies don't want that. That hurts their business. Now the second issue for these companies. Many of these companies, not all, but many, have made huge investments in China over the last 30 to 40 years. I'm talking hundreds of billions of dollars to produce in China for the American market. That's what so many Americans are feeling. The loss of good jobs, manufacturing jobs, unionized jobs, where the factories were closed down in Chicago or Cincinnati or New Jersey and moved to China, right? The whole premise of that, the profitability of that, and remember, these companies borrowed billions from American banks to do this, depends on being able to sell those products made in China by an American company back into the U.S. market. When Mr. Trump puts up tariffs, they can't do that. The profitability is undercut. They don't want that. They don't want tariffs here. They don't want tariffs there. They don't want tariffs. For those Americans who pay attention, and that's few on this subject, you will note that the United States Chamber of Commerce is against all of these tariffs and has been before, during, and to this minute of Mr. Trump's presidency. Now, they're playing a very powerful role. Their lobbyists are working night and day to shape what the American politicians in London these last couple days are doing with the Chinese. Then there are the companies on the other side who want the tariffs. For example, American companies producing aluminum and steel. Why? Because American companies producing aluminum and steel are among the least efficient in the world. They cannot compete anymore. And so they want tariffs, big ones, on Asian, European, and other steel and aluminum producers, because that allows them to jack up their prices just below what an imported version would cost, now very high because the importers have to pay a tariff which the domestic don't. it's a way of saving them and keeping their existence. And it will be very bad for Mr. Trump if they go out of existence. For example, a Japanese company wants to buy U.S. steel, and that has been percolating for years, that deal, because the Japanese produce steel better and cheaper than the Americans can. Here's a second example. The best and cheapest electric vehicles in the world are made by a Japanese company. Every truck, every car, electric, is now a problem for every American company. Every American company. If your company has a need for cars and trucks, one or the other or both, as part of the inputs to its production process, then every American company, whether it makes software or ice cream cones or anything else, wants to be able to survive competitively in the world economy. It wants to be able to do what every other company in the world can do that it competes with, namely buy the best electric cars and trucks for the lowest price. But Americans can't do that. And they are the only ones in the world held back from doing that. Why? Because the tariff against Chinese electric cars and trucks is currently 100%. 27% of that was put on by Trump in his first administration, and it was raised to 100% by Joe Biden. Just for those of you who want to think that there's a significant difference between the parties on this subject, which there isn't. Okay, every American company, including the many who don't even know what I've just told you, even though it's all public record, those companies have an interest, and enough of them know about it. Their lobbyists are saying, get rid of that. We want to be able to compete with the ice cream company in Canada or the what you name it, software plant in Mexico or anywhere else. They buy BYD trucks from China and use them. We can't. We have to pay more for an inferior GM, Ford, Tesla car or truck. They don't want that. This is dangerous for the American economy. Mr. Trump can't say that because if he admits what I've just said, he would then have shown the American people that what he's doing is not about what's good for America. It's not putting America first. It's making a choice between one group of businesses that are pushing him in one way versus another, and that's what he's actually doing, just as Mr. Biden did. But I'm putting America first is then exposed, so he can't. That's why he can't explain any of this and has to talk in abstractions, and that's why the media, when his handlers tell the media what they're doing, here's what comes out. The discussions in China, in London with the Chinese, are to make sure we get access to rare earths. What a lovely story. It makes such sense. We don't have access. We're going to get access. And our wonderful president is managing this taking this seriously, the U.S. documented statements around their meeting with the Chinese in London on Monday and Tuesday of this week. Taking any of that seriously is like the attempt to understand current world affairs by finding an old classic comic book in your attic, leafing to the middle of it, whatever page it is, and actually expecting something to emerge from those pages that will clarify what's going on. The two things have nothing to do with each other, which is why I've taken this time to try to give you an idea of what's actually going on as opposed to the noise being publicized.
Richard, the in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels wrote, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. So by the executive, like in the case of the United States, the executive branch would be the presidency.
Right.
When Marx and Engels wrote this, France had a monarchy of types, but it was really by that time a bourgeois state. England had a bourgeois state. Germany was still struggling to overcome feudalism. This was in 1848. But let's look at that sentence, that statement by Marx in the manifesto. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. Now, let's see if that statement is actually true today, whether it needs to be amended at all. And the reason I'm raising it is you've posed a sharp distinction between the Chamber of Commerce, and I would guess this is also true for the National Association of Manufacturers, business interests that are doing business in China don't want tariffs. They're making lots of money by investing in China. They can repatriate the profits back to wherever they are. China gets something, has gotten a lot from the deal. That's the quid pro quo. China has achieved new technology, et cetera, et cetera. But here you have the modern executive, the Trump administration, but before Trump, Biden, as you pointed out, who raised the tariffs on EV vehicles coming from China, even to a greater extent than Trump did in his first term. Yep. So is the government actually representing, is the executive branch of the government representing the bourgeoisie, meaning the capitalists? Or is there something about the modern state, which in general terms represents the bourgeoisie? Certainly, if workers go on strike, workers can't call the police and say, arrest that owner for treating us so badly, but the boss can call the police and have them come and arrest the picketers. So you can see that the state is on the side of the bosses, not the workers. But let's just talk about the modern state and its application here. There are obviously contradictions between the way the state, the American state, is managing its global empire and some of the commercial interests of the capitalists that purportedly this state represents. Anyway, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thought is I like Marx's, this may not come as a big surprise to you, I like Marx's quotation. I think to understand the state as the executive committee gives you a lot of insight into what it does and why it does it. But it leaves open, as Marx elsewhere makes very clear he knew, it leaves open the question, could there be circumstances under which one or another faction of the bourgeoisie is able to capture the executive committee, to make it function not so much in the general interest, as it normally would be expected to do and does, but for a period of time, favor one or another group within. It's kind of the same thing that happened if you look at any court of any ancient king. Was the king absolute? Yes. Did he reign over all the nobles? Yes. Did the nobles sometimes, however, conspire in one way or another to undo or to manipulate the king? Well, the answer is, we are grateful to William Shakespeare because that's most of what he wrote about. That exact thing happening when one or another duke or earl or somebody else captured the king, became the king himself, killed the king, killed the son of the king, all of the usual conspiracies of feudalism. Well, that can happen in capitalism too. And now you can take it another step, which a number of Marxist theorists did, Lenin in some ways, Gramsci in some ways, and others. It's usually, because they took it a next step, it's usually a sign of extreme stress in a society when this happens. When one or another part of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalist class, finding itself in desperate circumstances, then they may take the step of seeking to control the executive committee, the state, so it works in their favor, trying to get the other parts to take a back seat, willingly or unwillingly. And so these Marxists then took that idea and they began to show, and I would argue, that when you see extreme stresses is when you see the executive committee becoming partisan one way or another. And I don't mean to bring a different subject into us, but look at the decision of this government to send the military to repress its own people in Los Angeles over recent days. Now, that's not taking care of the bourgeoisie at a whole. For the bourgeoisie as a whole, the whole immigration issue is irrelevant. It's too small. It's 10, 12 million people in a population of 330. We have 10 economic problems more urgent than anything immigration can or cannot do. So what are you doing? Well, the answer is he's taking care, in this case, not of one or another part of the bourgeoisie, because they don't care. He's taking care of his own political apparatus and keeping it with him by acting out the theater that this all is. So there you can see that's an executive committee, but now the executive committee is taking care of whoever sits in the number one chair on that committee rather than. And by the way, if he continues to do what in effect widens the divisions, worsens the system, the people who run this system will get a new executive committee, and he will be a bad moment in American history and treated as such in the history books.
Yes, indeed. I so agree with you on that. And in the case of Los Angeles, 1 million families have an undocumented person in their family. So this is basically an invasion of a city that directly affects, big parts of the working class, meaning the part of the population that the capitalists in Southern California depend on. Those people are being targeted, and their families, they're working hard. They came here to work hard. Trump is gratuitously attacking them. And I saw a sign at one of the demonstrations, Richard. I'm going to end with this. One of the signs at the demonstration said, "The only minority that's hurting the country are the billionaires." And I thought, yes, that's completely apropos. Trump, representing some sector of the billionaires, is waging war against these hardworking immigrant families, but it's going to backfire on him. And you can see resistance is growing all over the country. It's not just in LA. People are demonstrating everywhere.